My guest today is Kent Guy, who has written three books on the Qing Empire. Among them is The Emperor's Treasure for Treasuries, The Qing Governor and their Provinces, and one that is currently being released, The Three Impeachments. And he has also worked as university professor on East Asian Studies at the University of Washington. And of course, as always, to begin to get to know or just a little bit. How did it come about to study the Qing Empire that we're going to discuss this week?
Well, uh, I I often like to say that the field of Qing history chose me. I didn't choose it. When I was in college, I decided that I wanted to major in history, and I picked more or less at random a course in Chinese history to start with. I liked it very much. It was recommended to me, and so I continued uh, studying Chinese history in university. And when I finished, I decided I would like to go to graduate school, but I first had to learn more Chinese. So I applied for a fellowship and I said, if I get the fellowship, I will go and learn Chinese. If I don't, I'll figure out what I want to do with the rest of my life.
And the rest is history, as they say.
And the rest is history. I got the fellowship. And so it was for the uh, next 40 years.
And of course, let's begin because Qing history is quite fascinating, as you know. So let's begin with the Ming Empire, which was the empire before the Qing. And I wanted to understand, in order to understand how the Qing came to power, what was the state of the current Ming Empire like at their end of their fall?
Well, the Ming Empire, which was founded in 1368, after the Ming had overthrown the Mongols, who ruled China for 100 years. The Ming Empire, by the early 17th century, was fairly weak. Its administration was inflexible for a variety of reasons. It didn't devote much of its resources to the military. Instead, it proposed to build a wall between itself and its enemies to the north. The wall didn't work. It's now called the Great Wall of China, and it didn't keep the Northerners out. So there was an inflexible leadership, lack of investment in military resources, and also recent research has suggested that there was a major climate change throughout the world in the early 17th century, in Europe as well as China. And this, in an agrarian empire, which the Chinese Empire was, a cooling of climate, what happened, can be absolutely devastating because it reduces tax revenues and creates famine and creates both epidemic and famine. So the Ming was certainly in trouble. I like to say the Ming wasn't pushed; it fell, and there were a hunter-gatherer and trading folk who lived to the northeast of the Ming in the region that today we call Manchuria. And they had various grievances against the Ming, and they were able to take the Ming capital in April of 1644. And then for the next generation, they were involved in a process of expanding their control of Ming China. It didn't happen overnight. They formed a government in the 1640s but really it was not until the 1680s that the Qing Dynasty controlled all of what had been Ming China.
Now, Robert T. Lowe, he argues that it wasn't
So,
certain.
so that when you ask why the Qing succeeded, the Qing, the leaders of the Qing were Manchus, not ethnically Chinese, and they were like many of the peoples of Northern Asia. They were people who were organized for war. They were organized into armies in which soldiers and their families were enrolled for life. And so the Qing were organized for war, and they were simply, I would say, far better organized for war than were the Ming.
Now, Robert T. Lowe, he argues that it wasn't certain that the Qing would become victorious and be the new dynasty of China. So, do you agree with this, that it wasn't necessarily that the Qing would become the victor of this?
No, well, when you say Robert Lowe, I think you mean William Rowe.
Well, that Rowe, that's it. Yes, I apologize. Yes,
okay.
That's it.
I think you mean William Rowe.
Yeah, that's it.
I think it was fairly predictable that the Ming would fall, but I'm not sure that it could be necessarily predicted that the Qing would be the victors. But they were well organized for war, and they were prepared to take the capital. But as I say, and I would emphasize, it was a process not just of a few years, but really of a generation before the Qing controlled, and before the Qing controlled most of the territory that the Ming had controlled. And it rested on a lot of Chinese collaborators who found the Qing simply better able to keep the peace than the Ming had been. And also by the 1680s, the weather had warmed and life became easier and better.
So what changed after the Qing government took over from the Mings? Did anyone know this? Did anything change for the peasant per se? Or I know that coinage did change, that minted in the Qing emperors, but apart from that, did anything change for rural China, or what exactly did change from the Ming coming over to
I
the
think
Qing?
probably for the peasantry, the change in government did not bring about a lot of change in their lives. But I do think that as the weather warmed, agriculture was more productive. The peasant lives improved, but that was not necessarily anything that the Qing did. That was a product of the changing environment. I do think the Qing was probably better able to keep the peace. They deployed their armies throughout China, well, not throughout the north part of China, and had garrison forces in many of the big cities of North China. But I'm not sure that the peasantry was necessarily, the peasant lives were changed in any radical way.
So let's talk about the Qing government and how the Qing government functions.
Okay. The Qing government was an imperial government, and the Qing adopted all of the institutions of the Ming. in fact, so that the Qing government, in fact, looked very much like the Ming government, at least in the beginning. There was an emperor. There were 6 ministries in the capital: the Ministry of War, the Ministry of Justice, the Ministry of Revenue, the Ministry of Personnel, the Ministry of Works or Public Works. And whenever I start to list the 6 of them, I can never come up with the 6th one. Oh, the Ministry of Ritual. There were these 6 ministries at the capital, and in the countryside there were provinces. Their number changed a little bit over time. Well, there were somewhere between 12 and 15 provinces, depending upon when you're talking about. They were organized into larger units. There was a governor general, governed 2 provinces, then provincial governor. Under the provincial governor were prefects, who were functionally defined officials, and under the prefects ultimately was the district magistrate. The district magistrate was the lowest ranked official of the Qing government, and he controlled all the functions of government. The 6 functions I mentioned above at the local level. And he a county was a fairly large unit, often several tens of thousands or even 100,000 people. So he often governed through local, using local or based on his relationships with local organizations. One formulation would be to say that the Qing government was actually a fairly narrow shell that lay on top of a large and largely self-governing society.
Now, in Europe, of course, whenever a new dynasty occurs, and to pick one example, when the Tudors came to rule England, there was always a concern about legitimacy, that they was not a usurper, as they very much were. But was this a concern for Qing China, that they were usurpers, that they had to legitimize their rule?
There was absolutely major issues of legitimacy. Not only was the Qing government new, but they were foreign. They were ethnically different. They spoke a different language than the Chinese did. Now, so the question is how to make themselves legitimate. And this was a very important theme underlying much of Qing government. And basically, the Manchus did it by adopting and patronizing Chinese scholarship and literature as much as they could. And you mentioned my first book on the which was titled "The Emperor's Four Treasuries," and it is the story of how the Qing set about to collect all the best books in China, and then they wrote they collected all the books, made a major catalog of them, commenting on all these books, which is very useful today. It's 5 volumes, and I can see it on my shelf at the moment. And this was a gigantic patronage effort that went on for 10 years. But I may say the Qing patronage of the Chinese scholarly world was a constant theme of Qing government beginning in the early 17th century. And the Qing would argue that the terms of their argument for their own legitimacy changed slightly over time, but the argument was that we are better able to preserve the universal principles of government than the Ming were.
Mhm.
They accepted the Confucian vision that the classical tradition laid down certain principles of government, and the Manchus argued, as I say, with slight differences in nuance, but that they could implement these classical principles of Chinese government as well or better than any previous Chinese government, and certainly including the Ming.
Now, imperial eunuchs, of course, were very much present in the Qing government as well, all the way up until the end in 1912. So, what was the role of an imperial eunuch? And of course, guiding the imperial harem was one of them. But what else were eunuchs
Okay.
role in the Qing government?
Well, first, I should note that the eunuchs were a very powerful force in the Ming Dynasty, based on their relationship with the emperor. They extended their control over a period of several hundred years over many of the institutions of Ming government. The Qing quite explicitly decided that eunuchs would not play that role in the Qing Dynasty, and instead, quite early on, at least as early as the 1650s, they decreed that the role of managing the imperial household, which had been the eunuch's responsibility, the Ming, would be carried out by a new institution called the Imperial Household Department, and it would be staffed by Manchus, not by eunuchs. Now, there were still eunuchs around the palace, but many fewer of them than in the Ming, and none that approached the political significance or importance of Ming eunuchs. So that really on the subject of eunuchs, you have to say that the Qing were used eunuchs much less than the Ming did. They were still there, but only performed the kind of routine tasks of maintaining the Forbidden City. They never acquired the political power that Ming eunuchs had.
So,
and the big institution of that type, as I say, was the Imperial Household Department, and it was staffed by eunuchs. Staffed by Manchus. Bear in mind that Manchus were enrolled for life in the army, and that also the Manchu society involved bondsmen or slaves, and these so that the Imperial Household Department, very often the actors were Manchus or their bondsmen, their slaves.
Now let's talk about imperial succession, because I want to bring up again, I'm going to do a little comparison here, because as you know, in the Ottoman Empire, if you want to become a sultan, you had to kill all your brothers in order to succeed. Was this kind of the same in Imperial Qing and in Imperial China as well, where if you did not want your brothers around, if you wanted to become the successor?
Well, I would say there was a very distant echo of the Ottoman practices in the Qing, but very distant, and it was overcome fairly soon. The of course, the Manchu tradition, when they came to power, before they were in power, the Manchus had a system of collegial rule where multiple people would serve, not well, multiple people would occupy the imperial position. When they became rulers of China, of course, the Manchus adopted the Chinese system, which is of a single ruler whom they called emperor. But the system of succession was troubled through the first, say, 50 years of, or no, well, 1640 to 1730, for the first 90 years of Ming rule. The first emperor in China was, in fact, an infant, and his uncle governed for him as regent. When the uncle died, the infant briefly became emperor in his own right, but then soon died of smallpox. So there was another regency which preserved some of the collegial features of Manchu rule. In 1661, shortly after the first emperor died of smallpox, a second child was enthroned, as I say, but he had the regency, which assisted him for the first 10 years. But this second child, who was known as the Kangxi Emperor, was educated in the Chinese tradition, was an intellectually curious and activist man. He governed quite successfully until 1723. He tried. The Chinese advised him to designate a successor. He did, but then became very dissatisfied with the son whom he designated as a successor. So he undesignated his son, and for the last 20 years of his reign, there was no designated successor. So that when he died in December of 1722, there was no undesignated successor. But excuse me, there was no designated successor. I'm sorry, but he had his fourth son, who in an article I haven't published, but I'm working on it. His fourth son, who really became his caretaker in his old age, probably very carefully managed the succession process so that the fourth son became his successor. But there was a great deal of hostility from many, because the Kangxi Emperor had many sons with and so that there was a great deal of protest over that succession. And afterwards, they began a process which was carried out to the end of the Qing rather, in which an emperor would designate a successor and put the name hidden away in a certain place within the palace, so that a successor would have been designated, but it would not be known publicly. And in fact, after the succession case of 1723, there really were no more disputed successions in the Qing Dynasty until the end of the dynasty. So we can say there is a distant echo of the Ottoman practice, but only in the early successions of the Qing.
Now, of course, religion as well will play a part in the Qing China, and they were very much Confucian practitioners. So,
Yes.
what role did Confucian's practice play in Qing China?
Well, as I've indicated, the Manchus were very concerned to represent themselves as, if you will, more Confucian than the Chinese. Uh, that is to say, and I want to be quite careful with that proposition. Um, Publicly, they were quite Confucian. However, they also maintained their Manchu practices. They maintained their language. They maintained the banner system, that is, the armies in which all Manchus were enrolled for their own people. But to legitimize their rule over China, they expressed fealty to many and all Confucian traditions. They patronized scholarship. They employed scholarly advisors and the like. Now, having said this, I would also say that with other peoples, uh, the Manchus did the same thing. That is, when they took over in Tibet, they pledged fealty to Tibetan traditions, and so they were served by Tibetan lamas. So they really were they faced in multiple directions, but they certainly did pledge fealty to the Confucian traditions.
Now, of course, trade relations, and this will become important in a second as well, as we will see with the West, because the West, of course, were very much interested in what China, the wares and plates and everything that China
Yes.
had. But of course, China weren't very much interested in what the West had, and they were certainly not interested in their technology. Was this kind of a mistake on China's hand in not adapting the Western technology, which, of course, I mean, we'll talk about this in a second, which caused them to lose the Opium War. But let's talk about trade relations with the Western
Well,
Europe first.
the here I think that there are several things to say. Yes, the Chinese were a continental sized empire, and they simply didn't need much in trade. But the reality was, as new research is showing, that there was a significant Sino Western trade for many centuries before for at least 4 centuries before the Opium War. Research done by Dennis Flynn and others has shown that, in fact, uh, vast amounts of Spanish silver found their way through the Philippines to China from the 15th century into the early 19th century. Um, Westerners were buying Chinese goods. They were buying porcelain. They were buying silk. They were buying tea. And in fact, the trade, there was a significant trade, but we need to understand that what was happening was that the Chinese were receiving silver, which became an unofficial currency, um, whereas the Europeans were receiving their trade goods. What happened in the 19th century then was not so much the beginning of trade with the West, but the moment at which the Westerners acquired the power to change the terms of trade with China. The Westerners were hemorrhaging silver to the Chinese Empire and wanted to stop that hemorrhage of this valuable material. So the Westerners had to come up with another good that the Chinese would buy instead of demanding silver.
Now, before we
And
go,
of course,
I'm sorry for interrupting you there, but before we go into the opium trade, I want to ask, what about other Asiatic powers? Did China trade with people like the Mongol? Sorry, not Mongols, but the Mughals, for example, the where the trade relation between the Mughals in India and China.
Trade. There was trade with Southeast Asia. There was a considerable rice trade with Vietnam, with Cambodia, and in the Philippines, and there were considerable. I've just read a very interesting new book by Melissa McCartney, which details very significantly the trade and immigration from the Chinese coast to the Philippines, to Vietnamese ports, to Thailand, to Singapore and Cambodia that took place from the middle of the 18th century on. And as I say, there was a significant rice trade where Southeast Asian rice was imported to China in return for Chinese manufactured goods that went back to Southeast Asia.
Now, before we go into the open trade again, I want to talk about the size of China because in Qing China it would be the closest to what we see in modern China is today. And I want to begin with controlling the borders of China and how they because you mentioned Great Wall, of course, but was it still relevant in Qing China, and how did control of the borders, because it's quite a significant large border to control, because it was gigantic.
Yeah, again, you have to remember that the Manchus were a people who were organized for war, and they, whereas the Ming had been content to dwell within their wall, the Manchu Qing Dynasty actively moved out to establish relationships and ultimately domination over much of Mongolia and Tibet. The control of Tibet began quite early, as in, some Qing presence in Tibet began as early as the end of the Kangxi reign, and Tibet ultimately became sort of a protectorate of the Qing Dynasty. During the 17th, first in the 1690s, and again in the 1750s and 60s, the Qing sent out conquering armies into Mongolia and incorporated large parts of Mongolia into the Qing Empire. Now, that's not to say that Mongolia or Tibet became, quote, Chinese provinces, end quote. They were managed by a different organization called in which we translate called the Court of Colonial Dependencies, the Li Fan Yuan. And these, so that the both Eastern and Western Mongolia and Tibet became a part of the Qing Empire, but if you will, not a part of China. And there were efforts to expand the Qing Empire to the south into Vietnam and into Burma were not nearly so successful. as the ones to the north. And that's partly because the Qing armies were more accustomed to fighting on the plains of Central Asia than they were in the jungles and river valleys of Southeast Asia. But the Qing, unlike the Ming, the Qing quite actively sought to expand to the north and to the west. And this has led to a very curious situation in the present era when when Tibet and Mongolia claim that they were not a part of China, but they were a part of the Qing Empire, but not of China. On the other hand, the current Chinese government has certainly claimed Mongolia and Tibet as their territory, as a part of China. And this sort of historical difference in the way people regarded the relationships here is now quite has now been quite fraught and quite difficult.
Mm-hmm. And of course, let's get into the opium trade. So that led into the Opium War, because after, like you said a while ago, the English began to find new products that would please, that they wanted to trade with the Chinese, and one of these would be opium. And of course, in India at the time, which was a great producer of opium and easy to get to China, the East India Company, of course, would become a massive both in production and sale of the opium. But it would be very quickly banned because the Qing government realized what a bad product this is. But they still kept going, and of course, this would lead into the Opium Wars. And let's talk about East Indian Company and the trade of opium into Qing China.
Yeah, well, the opium trade was always illegal. Although I suppose that prescription was not as rigidly enforced. But what, and you say the East India Company raised the opium in India. They then sold it to private traders who carried it to China, made their sales along the China coast, and took their money, and then took their money back to England and ultimately to Europe. So that really the opium traders were a group of often young men who were out to make their stake in Asia, and they often made the foundation of their fortune in Asia, and then very quickly tried to invest it in legitimate types of investment in Europe. So the East India Company, it was a very complicated system. As I say, the East India Company raised the opium in India, sold it to these traders. These traders then sold it in China. Then the traders used the offices of the East India Company to transfer their money back to Europe, because no one wants to be on a overseas voyage from China to England with a ship full of silver. That doesn't make any sense. You're too liable to piracy. So they sent their money back through the offices of the East India Company, and found, when had it deposited in English institutions. A few companies persisted in the opium trade. The British obviously Jardine Matheson and Company, the American Russell and Company. But most of the traders were in fact these young men out on the make. Now opium, as I say, the Europeans had to find a good that would create its own market. And what, if you think about it, what better way to create your own market than to sell drugs?
Mm.
And much of the drug sales were actually carried out on the ocean. That is, an opium trader would bring a ship full of opium along the China coast, and his counterpart, Chinese opium trader, would take his vessels out to meet the Western ship, buy the opium, and then the opium trader would take it into China and distribute it. And this was a very successful operation. Now the ideological, that is the in the English mind, the Opium War was about creating institutions of free trade, and you have to be careful, very careful with that justification, because in reality, free trade has existed all the way along for several centuries, but the Europeans were in the 1840s trying to change the terms of the trade. But there were mechanisms by which China could trade with foreign countries. They were complex mechanisms and different mechanisms that were known in the West, but there were such mechanisms before the Opium War. So the image that the opium traders or the Opium War opened at China needs to be we need to be very suspicious of.
Now, I want to mention this as well because, as you know, we talked about it will be banned very quickly because the real Qing government realized how bad that it was just killing their people.
Yeah.
That opium
Yeah.
was a bad product, and I don't remember what emperor this was, but there was an emperor who, because he really knew that in England Queen Victoria had banned opium as well, and he wrote to her in a letter. I'm not gonna say it word for word because of that, but it would go something along like, "You banned opium in your country, so you realize how bad it is. So why do you keep selling opium to my people, which you know it will destroy their lives?"
Exactly. That was probably the Dowager Emperor, who dispatched. There were two schools of thought about the opium trade in China. There were those who felt that, well, it's a bad thing, but we can tolerate it. And there were those who said, no, this is not simply an economic issue. This is a moral issue, and we're duty bound to prohibit it. Well, those who opposed the opium trade on moral grounds won out in a debate at the Daoguang court in 1839, 1840, and an official named Commissioner Lin Zexu was sent from, he'd been a very successful provincial governor in China, was sent from Beijing down to Canton as a representative of this moral political school. Commissioner Lin Zexu prohibited opium trade in Canton and seized all the stocks of opium trade that had been seized, all the stocks of opium that had accumulated around Canton, and ultimately burned them. This act was taken by the British as was taken certain segments of the British population as an act of war, and a British fleet was sent out to China to punish Commissioner Lin and reestablish the free flow of opium. So that there was, as I say, there was debate. Now, I've said there was debate within China what to do about the opium trade. There was also debate within England. There are those in the English Parliament who said, who recognized the moral character of the opium trade and felt that Britain had no place using its armies to enforce. But as I say, the merchant party in England won out, just as the moralists in China had won out, and that really is the beginning of the Opium War.
So let's talk about the Opium War because it would be a devastating defeat, and it of course would result in the Treaty of Nanking and the loss of Hong Kong from China. It would be a British province all the way up to 1997.
Yeah. Well, I think it is fairly well known when the British fleets arrived in China. It became clear fairly early on that their weaponry was better, their ships were stronger, and they would prevail in any battle between China and the West. So that if you think about the Opium War, there were really rather few battles. There were some action around Canton and some action up in Zhejiang province. There were not, but it was not a major war with campaigning. Both sides recognized that the British had the superior power, and the issue became one of how to negotiate a successful result. And as I'm sure your listeners are aware, the Opium War settlement was quite interesting. It initially permitted free trade and diplomatic representation for the British in 5 cities along the China coast. These were the terms of the Nanjing Treaty. There'd be free trade in 5 cities along the China coast, and again, diplomatic representation. It's interesting that the Nanjing settlement said almost nothing about opium. It was the result was expressed strictly in terms of free trade, and in fact, opium trade continued on the coast and in the 5 cities, but there was no provision in the Nanjing Treaty about opium.
It was implied between the lines.
Yes, it was all implied between the lines, and in the course of negotiations, there's some research suggesting that the Chinese negotiators didn't fully inform the Manchu emperor of what they had committed to. And similarly, at various points in the negotiations, the British felt that their negotiators had been had been undermined. There's the one very famous line about Elliot, who was a negotiator for the British in the early stages of the war. And when they received word that Elliot had secured the right to Hong Kong, the British.
I'm sorry, but I think your phone hand might be in front of the microphone. There you go.
Okay.
There you go.
When the British first heard that the Chinese had ceded Hong Kong, they said, "We sent Captain Elliot out to secure free trade, and all he has done is win a barren, waterless island of no value off the China coast." Now, their attitude toward that changed over the next century, but still, the negotiation was a long process, that a long and complicated process. And there were, in fact, we often talk about two Opium Wars, or the Opium War in two stages, and various settlements were found, and various settlements were achieved and then found to be unacceptable, until finally the British and French in the 1860s invaded North China and took the city of Beijing and forced the Manchu emperors to flee to Manchuria. They came back, but still, it was the burning.
So, of course, quite quickly. Sorry, your sound is a little bit out. Sorry, about 5 seconds. Just. Okay. So yeah, the Opium War, of course, was a great failure for the Chinese, and it's a great victory for the British. But let's something that happened fairly quickly after the after the Opium War would be the Taiping Rebellion, and let's talk about the Taiping Rebellion in the 1850s.
Okay, well, first of all, to put the Taiping Rebellion in some context, from the end of the 18th century down to the middle of the 19th century, there was increasing violence in the Chinese countryside. Population pressure was straining against the Chinese resources, and there were rebellions of one form or another, beginning in the, let's say, 1770s and going down to 1850. The Taiping was distinguished so that the idea that groups were dissatisfied with the Qing was not at all unprecedented. What was unusual about the Taipings were that they had a remarkable ideology. They had gotten some portions of the Christian faith through missionary efforts in China, and the Taipings adopted these elements of the Christian faith. And one of the differences is, of course, you have in the biblical Old Testament, you have many visions of an angry God, anxious to destroy the peoples that he had created. And the Taipings picked up on this vision of an angry God. And the Chinese had always had some vision of Tian, or heaven, which could, at the extremes, intervene in human affairs. This is the well-known expression, the mandate of heaven has changed. The Chinese always had that notion, but heaven was never as angry or as direct or as forceful as the Christian God. And so that the Taipings really found a new weapon to use against the Chinese state, which was a new ideological weapon to use against the Chinese state. The Taipings came from a minority, the early Taiping leaders were a minority group in China who had been discriminated against and had, well, they'd had mixed success, but they'd also experienced considerable discrimination. They were angry against their environment, and they picked up this image of an angry God. And then, as they began to march north, various other groups who had many grievances against the Chinese state joined them. So their army grew just very, very rapidly. Now, not all of the new converts bought the angry God notion, bought all the, and you know, the leader of the Taiping imagined himself the younger brother of Jesus Christ. Not all of those who joined the Taiping movement were necessarily accepted this new ideology of rebellion. But because there were many grievances in the Chinese state, the Taiping movement grew very rapidly as it marched north, and eventually was able to take the city of Nanjing, where they held out, established a rebel organization, and held out for 10 years.
Mm.
The Chinese response to the Taiping was organized by a man named Zheng Guofan. And Zheng really took the idea that we Chinese need to set aside all of our differences now and concentrate on resisting the Taiping. And he gradually built up an army. He led the army against Nanjing and finally was able to defeat the Taiping. But in the process of doing that, really, one can almost say that Zheng Guofan created a new notion, because before the 19th century, this term we use today, Confucianism, would probably not have, was not terribly widely used in China. There were various schools of thought, some supported by the state, some others unorthodox in various degrees. But the idea that they all constituted one big brand called Confucianism was not perhaps as strongly felt before the Taiping as after. It was in some ways it was a creation of Zheng Guofan and his desire to create an ideology to resist the Taiping.
Mm.
Of course, the Taiping was an enormously bloody affair. Millions of people were killed, and it was a major break in the. It was a major break in the Qing Dynasty's rule of China.
Mm. Of course, someone I've been looking forward to talking about. I would say I think one of the most famous sovereigns of China, of late Imperial Qing China, and that is of course the what she would become known as the Dowager Empress
The Dowager
Cixi.
Empress, yes.
And I've been rather looking forward to talk about her, and so let's talk about the rise of she, because it's rather quite a fascinating story, and I would say compare her to Queen Victoria, because she would rule for half a century,
Yes,
and more, if not more, in Qing China for the next half century until almost the fall of the Qing Empire.
yes. What is amazing to me is that after having one of the largest rebellions in world history and the defeat of the Opium War, the Qing did not fall in the 1860s, but then survived for another half century.
Hmm.
How was that possible? Well, um, the Dowager Emperor is, of course, a very, uh, there are many comments about her, many observations. But one of the,
Perhaps one of the most famous books about her is by Yun Chang, who wrote a recent biography
yeah,
of her.
yeah. Now, I have not read that volume, but it's always struck me that in outline, what the Dowager, what occurred. First of all, Dowager emperors were not absolutely unprecedented, but very rare in Chinese tradition. There had been several of them, but not many by any means. And so the legitimacy of the Dowager Empress was uh, was problematic from the beginning. What she did was to make allies of the people who had defeated the Taiping Rebellion. She made allies of them and she ruled through them.
Now,
And in,
something I'm sorry again to interrupt you, but we should also mention that, well, of course, he was a concubine, began the concubine of the emperor, and then when
yeah,
he died, what was common in Chinese tradition was that when an empress became, a dowager, she would never have sex again with sexual relations with any man
yeah.
again. So we should mention as well the Chinese tradition in this.
Well, yeah, and I'm not one. I'm not an expert uh, on the Empress Dowager's sex life by any means. But she did. Um, the the interesting, at least my perspective here, is that she created really uh, a qualitatively different sort of Qing government for these last 50 years, where she relied very heavily on the men who would put down the Taiping Rebellion to govern China. Whether one book sees the Empress Dowager's reign as the last stand of Chinese conservatism, but I'm not sure. I would incline to see her as experimenting with new styles of rule, um, and because the men who would put down the Taiping Rebellion became very interested in Western styles of rule and Western weapons of war, and so they began a process that was called self-strengthening, that the Empress Dowager sponsored, a process of trying to build up the uh, China's armies, trying to develop Chinese economies, trying to adopt modern technologies of production and warfare. And this self strengthening became the sort of dominant theme of Chinese rule from the 1860s into the 1890s, and was really a very different kind of Qing government than you had seen before the Empress Dowager came to power.
Now, in the 1888, and so do forgive me for jumping a little bit in time, but in 1888, of course, the Japan had been an isolated
Yes.
power at the time, would become, of course, for the next half century, a dominant power in Asian history. And I believe the Meiji Dynasty was at the time rising to
Yes.
power as well, and they would, of course, wage their was the first war against China. So how did that? But let's talk about the Chinese-Japanese War.
Well, the Sino-Japanese War was probably one of the most significant episodes in China's 19th century history, because it effectively brought to an end the policy of self-strengthening. And one of the main self-strengtheners, in fact, was injured during the Sino-Japanese War, and a man named Li Hongzhang, and it marked the end of his active political life. But the vision throughout China was that self-strengthening had failed. We had lost to what had been a previous tributary state. Self-strengthening had failed, and with that, the notion was that the Qing Dynasty had failed, which became very widespread from the 1890s into the first decade of the 20th century. So the domestic impact of the Sino-Japanese War was just huge. One famous intellectual, Liang Jichao, said, "Our nation will be cut up like a melon into little pieces," because after the Sino-Japanese War, the Western powers, including Japan, began to carve out spheres of influence, kind of proto-colonies throughout China. So they're really, the Sino-Japanese War was, in a sense, the end, in one sense, the end of Qing rule. There were another 10 years in which the Qing or the Empress Dowager and her advisors tried to significantly restructure Qing administration, but these efforts were ultimately unsuccessful. So I really count the Sino-Japanese War as close to the end as the end, in fact, of Qing rule in China.
Now, something else that I want to talk about that the Dowager Empress tried to do, and we talked about that the Chinese did not, and Qing did not really want the Western technology, but what I seem to understand and Qing does is that she tried to build railroads, and she tried to, modernize the country with telegrams, and of course this would eventually lead to the Boxer Rebellion as well, because most people seem to be opposed to railroads and to modern technology in Qing China.
Well, yeah, certainly the Boxer Rebellion, but I wouldn't have thought necessarily of railroads, but the Boxer Rebellion started around a German colony that was set up in Shandong, in the area of Qingdao, and this name may be familiar to you today, because what did the Germans do in their colony? They brewed beer. And so today we have Qingdao beer from China. But the hostility between the Germans and the local Shandong peasantry was what first created the Boxer armies. And the Empress Dowager didn't know quite what to do with the Boxer armies. They were potentially, at least, a weapon she could use against Westerners, against foreigners, because after all, they began as an anti-foreign force. But they also were, in certain respects, anti-Chinese. So she didn't act against them. And of course, the Boxer armies marched uh, from Shantung to Beijing, laid siege to the foreign legations there, and once again, the court fled, um, and the Boxers laid siege to the foreign legations, and one can see the uh, uh, Empress Dowager's miscalculation of what she could do, a miscalculation in the Boxer episode, was enormously costly. The treaty, the Boxer Indemnity, would have taken up all of the excess revenue of the Qing government until 1945, if it had been ever been fully paid off. So that it was an extremely costly mistake for the Empress Dowager to make. But I think it's important to realize that the Boxers were both anti-foreign and anti-Chinese.
Now let's
Or
be-
anti-Qing.
now let's begin with, of course, the death. We had the death of Dowager Empress Cixi, and of course, what would be the end in 1912 of the Qing Dynasty and Emperor Pu and his
Emperor
brief
Pui.
and his brief reign.
Well, Pui is always a good story. There's the movie the movie that's made about him, The Last Emperor. He was in fact an infant when the Empress Dowager died. Shortly thereafter, there were a series of political. There was a small political rebellion in the central China city of Wuhan, and gradually, of course, one of the Qing innovations in the first decade of the 20th century was the creation of provincial assemblies. And so what happened in October of 1911, this military rebellion at a garrison in central China was able to hold out against the Qing armies for several weeks. And the Chinese newly assembled in their provincial assemblies, the provincial assemblies simply began to secede from the dynasty. There was no provision, of course, that they could succeed. Provinces were meant as units of control, not as units of popular sovereignty. But they did succeed. And by 1912, enough of the provinces had, quote, seceded, end quote, that the advisors of Pui abdicated on behalf of the emperor, and a new ruler was set up in Beijing. And as you probably know from the story, though, the emperor continued to live within the Forbidden City for a number of years, surrounded by the eunuchs who had brought him up, and sort of unaware of what was going on in the rest of the Chinese empire. Ultimately, and he lived for a while after he was made to leave the Forbidden City. He lived for a while in the city of Tianjin. And then ultimately, during the Sino-Japanese War, he set up he was the leader of a puppet regime in a state that the Japanese created in Manchuria called Manchu War. Manchu War was simply the Manchu state, and the Manchu emperor was head. They took Puyi and made him head of the Manchu state, and he was, as I say, it was a puppet state of the Japanese during the Second World War.
Now, we spoke about in the beginning how the rural population changed from the Ming to the Qing Dynasty. But was it the same kind of from going from Qing to the Ming, so from the Ming to the Qing as going from the Qing to the Chinese Republic, or was there not much different at all in China as a whole?
Um, that is a very difficult question, and I'm sorry there was a failure in the technology here.
That's fine, don't worry.
Yeah, that's a very difficult question. Certainly, life changed in China. I think much more in the turn of the 20th century than it had from Ming to Qing. But whether the fall of the Qing was responsible for these changes or not, I think is a question you can ask. Just as peasant life changed from Ming to Qing in part because of the warming of the climate, which the Qing had nothing to do with. Peasant life changed from the Qing to the Republic in the sense that there were many new there were new markets, new goods that came in to change Chinese life, and you can, I mean, the list is the list of new technologies, new goods that changed Chinese life is very long. There's a very famous old novel called Oil to Light the Lamps of China. I think it's the name, I've forgotten, which talks about a Western merchant traveling from city to city in China, trying to sell oil lamps. And these, of course, brought oil and the new technology into Chinese villages. But there were changes in cropping patterns in China to meet international demands. There were new goods in the Chinese countryside. Roads and railroads penetrated areas which had been inaccessible before, and all of these things probably did make. I think probably peasant life changed more from the Qing to the early Republic than it had from the Ming to the Qing. But again, whether the fall of the political leadership necessarily brought about this change is a question. Is a question I think to be asked.
What about international politics? You mentioned did anything change in political form and the government from Qing to the Republic?
Well, China was in these years the very weak man of Asia, and I'm not sure that changed very much from the Qing to the early Republic. I don't think that in sort of diplomatic terms, China's or world power terms, China's political position or position in international matters changed all that much. There was a prevailing fear really well into the 20th century that China would lose its economic and political sovereignty. And one can envision the 20th century in China as an attempt by a variety of means, but basically by whatever means would work, to reestablish the political and economic sovereignty of the Chinese in China. And I think, without meaning to make excuses, if we see today the Chinese being rather, from our point of view, rather nationalistic, we need to remember that for the last century, the recapturing of economic and national sovereignty has been the predominant goal of the Chinese state.
And I think we don't round it up there. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Before you go, do you have anything you want to promote? And where can people buy your books, and when is your new book coming out?
Well, you can always look for my books. I would note that the third book, The Three Impeachments, is not, quote, being released. I've finished it, and it's in process, but you probably won't find it to purchase for a while yet.
Thank you so much for coming on. It's been a pleasure to have you on the podcast. My name is Alan. This has been That Aged Well. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iTunes, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts these days. If you are on iTunes, please consider writing a review. That would help us out a lot. Please like, share, and subscribe. And I'll see you next time.